invite you to come down and take a seat so that you can be part of the Q&A and questions that you all have. Thank you. All right, Lou.
Doug, you used a phrase that I really love, which is, what is our obedience level, or do we lead? And last night I asked Thomas a question, and I would like for him to maybe repeat his answer so everybody can hear. My question was, if the state preempts us in Alachua County from enacting a Bill of Rights for the Santa Fe River, do we just close up and go home? Or can the county commission go ahead and enact and put that on the ballot so that we can vote on it? And how do we respond in the situation we're in right now to this idea of state preemption?
Lou's going to make me work. So you got to do it anyway, right? Because we've all talked about a rigged system. Preemption is just another piece of that rigged system. Do we really expect the Florida legislature not to act to preempt when what you guys are putting forward is a threat to almost every major industry in Florida that currently treats nature as an externality? That's the question. Do we really expect the Florida legislature not to do something? Of course not. They're going to do what they do, and they're doing it. And they're helped by both Republicans and Democrats, because the committee votes coming out are almost unanimous. The Democrats are voting with the Republicans on this particular piece of legislation. So the fact is they're going to do it. That's not a question. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And you have two choices. You can either say, oh, we're preempted, we can't do it, we're going to go home, and we're going to work in the regulatory system or do whatever. Or you say we're going to do it anyway. And I guess the one thing I didn't talk about last night was, you know, why people do things in the first place when there's not necessarily a roadmap that has been mapped out for the next 10 years for you. It's like people have a lot of questions about practical applications of rights in nature. There's a huge amount of questions about practical application, but that's not a reason not to do it, right? Sometimes you got to do it anyway. And I was joking to someone outside about the good news is you're at the beginning of rights in nature work. The bad news is that you're at the beginning of the beginning. You get a chance to make it, make the path by walking it or whatever the saying is. So you have to do it anyway. And what that means is, we've done a lot of thinking of this stuff over the past 15 years. It's why rights of nature by itself, it's not by itself, it's a democratic right. The democratic right stuff has to come with it, because eventually you're going to have to argue that your municipalities, your counties, your towns, your villages, your subunits, municipal units, that you as people, a majority of people within those municipalities, have the legal authority to adopt certain laws that can't be preempted. Okay? I don't know how to put it any more straightforward, but that there's a constitutional right that exists to self-governance. That you have a right of local community self-government that can be exercised, and as a constitutional right assertion to pass those laws, that the state cannot preempt you. That the state is acting unconstitutionally and illegally in preempting you. That's the argument that you have to run when you run into these challenges. And it gets complicated because you're going to have elected officials who run from you when you ask them to do anything, because they're going to say, well, we're preempted and that's the end of the story. Well, that's not the end of the story, and you're going to have to press them on that. It means shifting a lot to citizen initiative and petitions to go around your elected officials. That's eventually what has to happen as well, if you don't have elected officials willing to move it. But eventually you end up in court. Eventually you have pre-election challenges where the corporations will try to stop you from even putting stuff on the ballot. And keeping it from people taking vote on it and voting on it, because they'll say, well, it's preempted by the state. Well, we can, say the word preempted all we want, and every time we do, we kind of validate it, but you got to do it anyway. And the final thing that I'll say on this is that, we're very obedient people in the United States, almost obedient to the point of suicide. But I compare what communities are doing now, whether it's fracking or these projects or rights of nature work, as kind of like sitting at the counter in the civil rights movement. The very first counter sit-in was 3 African Americans who had no idea what was going to happen next. They had no clue. They did something because it was morally right, they did something because it was ethically right, and they felt a need to do it. But they didn't know there was going to be 300 sit-ins in the 3 weeks after that. They had no idea. They brought their toothbrushes because they figured they were going to get arrested and they would need toiletries in prison. And so I think what this is about is that kind of act of civil disobedience on a collective level. It's not just sitting in front of a bulldozer where the criminal system comes crashing down on you. It's a collective act of civil disobedience to say the system is not working, we're going to replace it, and you don't have the constitutional or legal authority to stop us. That has to be your confrontation point, because otherwise you just validate the entire freaking system that you're trying to stop when you recognize these principles and these doctrines.
Could you say that again? The system is not
It's a collective act of civil disobedience.
working. And you say the system is not working what? The system is not working.
You need to replace it.
Yeah.
To your question, understand this, and Tom, right there with Tom. Think about this. In the Supreme Court, both in the United States Supreme Court and just every Supreme Court in the United States, there's just like a presumption of innocence when you're in a criminal deal. There's a presumption that all laws enacted by a newly elected legislative body or governing body is constitutional until shown otherwise. Make them show otherwise. Make them prove that wasting your community, putting your property and life in danger is justified. Make them put the burden on them by enacting what you need to enact the same way it's no different than what we did in Pittsburgh. I can find you 1,000 legal scholars out there that said that what we did there was not right. And someone actually in the environmental side pushed back because I was dealing with him. Because believe me, a lot of the green organizations, when I went there, boy, did I get pushed back. That's where I got most of my pushback. What are you doing with this guy? He's a leading radical. I was on our team. You have the presumption that what you're doing is right. And until shown otherwise, it stands.
Okay, gentleman in the blue here.
Oh, okay. I have a kind of a mundane question, and it's for Chuck O'Neill, because of something that you said just prior to this panel. You had mentioned 2 bills to preempt the rights of nature before the legislature. You said House Bill 1199, Senate Bill 1382, if I read that correct. What Florida House and Senate committees are those bills being considered in?
You can look that up. The easiest way to do it is just to Google, for instance, SB 1382, Florida Senate. All the even numbers are Senate bills, the odd numbers are House bills. But if you pull it up, it'll show you where it is in the process. I think it finished up. And there's a computer here.
You no longer have to wonder about it.
There's a wait for
Hey, there you go. There you go. That's what I was looking for.
Okay, it's passed out of Environment and Natural Resources. Okay, keep going down. Okay, it's now an Appropriations Subcommittee. If you go back up, now click on the committee, Appropriations Subcommittee on Agriculture. Click on that, I'll show you who the members of that committee are. Okay. Does anybody recognize any of those names?
Boo. Linda Stewart, she's Orlando.
Yes. What's Stewart?
I've spoken with Senator JGR Jose Javier Rodriguez's office to hopefully introduce an amendment to strike that from the bill, because there's more in the bill than just the preemption. But if any of those people are your state senator, that's where the major impact is. Damn it. There are 3 orders in which legislature listens to people. Number 1, they listen to their donors first. Number 2, they listen to their constituents. And number 3 is everybody else. So if you're calling from outside the district and you're saying, hey, vote against this, really, if you live in any of those districts, those are the people you need to call.
Looking at the